Okay, shall we make a start? It's 9:05, and we have some violence to do with the state. I have two announcements to make. By the way, I'm James Vernon. I'm standing in for Ethan, whose voice is holding up, but we're saving his what's left of his vocal cords for this afternoon. I have two announcements to make. One is really for Mike Braddock. Man United just won. But gloriously, the rich Chelsea lost to Wigan. So, and the other announcement is that lunch is going to be outside on the terrace this afternoon. After this session, is it after this session? No. Later this morning, and we're going to be served. So that will be splendid. So it's my pleasure to introduce this terrific panel, starting with Krista Kesselring. I can never remember how I say it. Dalhousie.
That's right.
Got it. Krista Kesselring is an associate professor of history and gender and women's studies at Dalhousie University. She received her PhD from Queen's University in 2000. And since then has published 2 books. That's shameful. Mercy and Authority in the Tudor State, Cambridge 2003, and The Northern Rebellion of 1569, Faith, Politics and Protest in Elizabethan England. I'm sorry, I'm sort of staggering from the 2 books.
They're small books.
It takes me 15 years for every single one. She's now writing a book on the forfeiture of felony property to the state in Britain from the Middle Ages to the 19th century.
I don't think it's going to be a book, just a series of articles. So
right.
hopefully.
Still, you know. Brendan Case is Assistant Professor of History at the University of Connecticut. He received his MPhil in Irish Studies from the National University of Ireland, Galway, and a PhD in History from Princeton. And he taught at Notre Dame before landing in Connecticut. He's published widely on Anglo-Irish relations in the early modern period, and his books, The Politics and Culture of Honour in Britain and Ireland, 1541 to 1641, is due out from Cambridge University Press in December. So you can probably pre-order it on Amazon now.
Yeah, if you have a fat wallet.
Right. Well,
no problem.
But yes, the holidays are coming.
Priya Satia, and I'm introducing them in the order that they're speaking, is Assistant Professor of History at Stanford University, where she's been since she received her PhD from Berkeley in 2004. She has published widely on issues of technology and warfare in the modern British Empire, most recently in her book Spies in Arabia, The Great War and the Cultural Foundations of Britain's Covert Empire in the Middle East. That's quite a subtitle, actually. Daniel Ishuskin received his PhD from Berkeley. This is, you know, we're clearly peddling something here. In 2007, he's now the Rothschild postdoctoral fellow here, well, basically anywhere, but we're lucky to have him here this year. And he's revising his dissertation for publication. It's going to be called Morale, a History. Okay, so Krista, over to you.
Okay. Well, good morning. I'm not so sure that sitting here is the wisest thing. It seems to have been the hot spot in the last 2. But my comments, I think, will be quite general, just intended as a sort of reminder about 16th century violence, because some of the discussion seems to have focused on the modern era. And I'd like to start simply by suggesting that we need to retain or restore violence to the center of our understanding of the early modern state. Violence was a key constituent of state power, and this is so even if we use a fairly restricted definition of violence, such as the one advocated by Peter Sperenberg in his programmatic piece on the subject. Sperenberg defined violence as, quote, the intentional encroachment upon a person's physical integrity. Now, as he notes, in some ways, this is a broader definition than one might find elsewhere. It's broader in that it rejects the moral or legalistic restrictions, which for some people mean that physical force by agents of the state are automatically excluded from any talk of violence. Some limit violence to any force that is inherently illegitimate, unacceptable, or prohibited by law, and this definition avoids that. But his definition of violence is much narrower than many others, in that it remains grounded in the physical. It excludes psychological violence or the symbolic violence of gifts or credit or any such things like this. For Sperenberg, words are emphatically not bullets. Now, I don't agree with his notion that all these other concepts should be abandoned altogether. In some contexts, for some questions, it can be useful to talk of systemic, symbolic, or structural violence, although we might want to relabel some of these things as coercion and save violence for physical acts. For present purposes, my basic point is that when I refer to violence being at the center of state power, I simply mean intentional physical harm, nothing fancier than that. Now, definitions of the state have traditionally been premised on two key elements: control of a defined geographical area and some sort of control of violence. Numerous formulations of this exist. The classic, of course, is that the state, quote, exercises a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. Subsequent theorists have recognized an essential truth to this, but have had problems with both monopoly and legitimate. Charles Tilly opted to talk of the state having a, quote, more or less successful claim to control the chief concentrated means of violence. Some have spoken of a comparative advantage. Michael Braddock wrote instead of the state as, quote, the ultimate arbiter of what constituted legitimate force. Now, this sort of formulation is helpful, but we might also note that the state did claim a monopoly on coercion that rested on deadly force. So yes, heads of household legitimately, by the standards of the day, disciplined wayward wives, children, and servants, but they did not lawfully, legitimately use lethal violence to do so. So the early modern state claimed to be the ultimate arbiter of what constituted legitimate force, and also exerted a claim to a monopoly on coercion resting on lethal violence. In the 16th century, these claims to arbitrate, monopolize, proceeded apace. Perhaps most significantly, we have the harnessing of the nobility. This isn't necessarily the demilitarization of the nobility. A lot of recent work has focused on the continued strength of a martial ethos. But however we want to nuance the story, we are still talking about a taming or a harnessing of the interests of the nobility. And this, of course, had effects on state use of violence in both an external and an internal context. In terms of war-making abilities, the war-making capabilities of the state, we have such well-known developments as the Marian militia statutes, the creation of the trained bands, the expansion and routinization of the lord lieutenancies, the use of contracted privateers and mercenaries, and the delegation of powers to mercantile companies also figure into this. Domestically, there's the exertion of control over the ancient liberties and other such efforts to ensure that justice operated in the sovereign's name, or through license from the sovereign alone, at least for crimes punishable by death. There's the expansion of felony and treason law, and the numerous modifications that made these laws more readily enforceable. There's the increased use of torture and martial law. And of course, the royal courts ordered many, many executions, perhaps the highest number in any period in English history, certainly higher than in any period since. Conservative estimates suggest some 600 to 700 executions per year. Steve Hindle estimated some 75,000 judicial deaths in the century before 1630. Certainly, surviving court records show an average of about 25 a year in both Devon and Essex in the final years of the 1500s. As James Sharp, Steve Hindle, and others have noted, this dwarfs numbers from the 18th century. For the late 1500s, allowing for plenty of fuzziness since we're working from two sets of estimates, we're talking a penal death rate of about 15 per 100,000 for the country as a whole, and possibly as high as 60 per 100,000 for the City of London, where annual rates of execution of about 150 have been found for the early 1600s. That's a penal death rate on par with the murder rate today in places like Rwanda and Colombia, and incidentally far higher than the homicide rate for the same period, which Coburn has estimated to be about 5 or 6 per 100,000. Now, the list of manifestations of early modern state violence could be extended, but beyond noting the ubiquity of violence, it's important to note, too, that this violence wasn't just mechanically instrumental, but also a form of political communication, Executions dispatched messages as well as offenders. They had a significance beyond mere numbers alone. In the turn to studies of political culture, this expressive or communicative quality of violence sometimes seems to be forgotten. We can now read fine-grained analyses of the ways in which a portrait or progress contributed to the construction of royal authority or to habits of obedience, but often juxtaposed against a throwaway line that since the crown only executed a couple dozen monks or a couple dozen rioters, somehow force was irrelevant. If we can be asked to believe that a closed versus an open crown on a coin was somehow deeply significant for the maintenance of order, surely we can do so without disregarding the effects of a cityscape littered with the limbs of executed traitors, whipping posts, and things of this nature. The role of violence is a multifaceted aspect of state power, sometimes, I think, overlooked in the turn to studies of the culture of politics and in the turn to talk of negotiation and participation. The rejection of crude state-society binaries seems to have led to a reluctance to engage with violence, at least in the domestic context. But talk of violence doesn't need to assume such a binary. Rather, it can make our discussions of the nature and significance of participation richer and more accurate. The turn to talk of negotiation and participation has clearly had value. But the context of violent coercion, its use in setting the parameters and forms of participation, and in encouraging parties to negotiate, must always be borne in mind. So too must the ways in which individuals called upon or participated in state violence to serve their own ends. Now, Ethan asked us to be a bit provocative in our comments, so let me end with this. When accounts of the state try to ignore its violence, I think one must ask why. When they try to make participation equal consent in some unproblematized way, one must ask why. What ideological work does this do? Or what contemporary fantasies does this impose on the past? To borrow a phrase from Crispin Sartwell, a political philosopher, is such an account perhaps no more than a masochist ecstasy? And I'll leave it at that.
As Krista said, we were told to be provocative, and I've already learned quite a bit by listening to Krista. My approach to this was simply to try to sort of think through some of the questions that were generously given to us as panelists, and just see if I could sort of present some questions, hopefully help spark some conversation. And so I want to do four things. One is, in thinking about the relationship between violence and the state in the early modern period, one, we should think more broadly about what constituted the British state. Two, we should interrogate what we mean by violence. And here, I think already Krista has spoken quite nicely about this. Three, we should question the chronology of the emergence of the state, which seems to have been placed quite firmly in the 16th century this weekend. And four, we should question the assumption that violence was the sanction of last resort for the state, and consider to what extent it was prime mover of legitimacy. What does that mean? Part one. The reason I'm here, I suppose, is that I work on Ireland and English-Irish relations, and thus I might be able to offer some sort of larger British perspective on the relationship between violence and the state. And I want to start by saying that the British state only looks small, liberal, and measured in its use of violence if we think of it as the English state. But if we understand Ireland to be a constituent part of the British state, and here I want to get away from notions that Ireland and Kenya are equally part of the state. But I do want to suggest that this is the case for the Tudor and early Stuart periods. Then the matter of violence in the state looks rather different than what most writings on the state tell us. So in spite of already having had numerous conversations on the controversial nature of this, I will stick to my guns, to use a metaphor of violence, and offer up the suggestion that Ireland is a vital element in making the Tudor and early Stuart versions of the British state. I mean, here I think terminology really lets us down, but the state that it was, and that as a consequence, the early modern state centered in London was tremendously violent in spite of the great amount of ink spilled over the years in arguing that violence domestically, as opposed to domestic violence, was decreasing over the 16th and 17th centuries. So just a quick sort of explanation of what I might mean by this. In the course of working on honor amongst early modern English and Irish nobles, I read a lot of secondary material that claimed that violence was in decline over the course of the 16th and early 17th centuries, people like Lawrence Stone, Mervyn James, and that this decline in interpersonal violence and the concomitant increase of appeals to the law signaled the modernity of English state and English people. This seems suspiciously congratulatory to me, and from my perspective, somewhat fantastical for those those same newly Pacific Englishmen, once they crossed over the water, seem to have forgotten all their modern self-restraints when acting in Ireland. So here was subject-on-subject violence, the sort of which was supposed to have been banished before the lights of reformed religion, education, and an interest in nobility as service, not as aggressive self-aggrandizement. So that's my first thought, that the much vaunted drop in violence in the 16th and 17th century only makes sense if you look at English actors acting in England. In Ireland, they are not only still violent, but spectacularly so, and more so than in the purportedly rough and ready medieval world of wanton interpersonal violence. Many, many counter-arguments to this, I know. And one of them simply is that my perspective mixes apples and oranges, specifically that I'm conflating domestic and colonial violence. But I'm willing to try to close that gap by saying that the vast majority of people who speak of the London-centered state in the 16th and 17th centuries are really speaking of an English state when in fact the reality was more complex. And I wish to suggest that Ireland is a vital constituent part of a Tudor state, early Stuart state, and therefore violence in Ireland is not the unfortunate, if perhaps explainable, result of cultural contact and the failed attempts by English and Irish players to sort of, as they interact over large cultural and social gaps, but rather one more example of subject-on-subject violence that was supposed to have diminished considerably over the course of the period. But wasn't Ireland an English colony? Yes and no. It had elements of one as far back as the 12th century, stretching, some would say, into the present. But it was also a kingdom. It was under authority of the crown. Its peoples were subjects of the same king as English subjects. Yes, English monarchs claimed the kingship of France, but the claim to Ireland was ratified in a parliament in Dublin. And the taking of the Irish crown seems to me to have helped Henry VIII's claim to imperial kingship used in his break with Rome. Moreover, Irish lords, Gaelic as well as Anglo-Norman, were made earls and barons. They sat in the Irish Parliament. They adopted primogeniture. The island's provinces were shired, with Gaelic elites often holding offices in them. Some took charters to hold markets and courts. Common law was gradually introduced, etc. Moreover, Irish elites were keen to ally themselves with the London state. The project of surrender and regrant, by which these characters made their submissions to the crown and received back English-style heraldic titles and the patent for their lands, was one made possible, on the one hand, by English notions that Irish elites were co-optable regional power brokers, not savages, and on the other, and this is key, that by Irish interests to benefit by the powers and protections of state-sanctioned power. Thus, the initial efforts to roll Ireland and its peoples more closely into a larger polity centered in London was thus not done through violence, but through peaceable transference of the sorts of rights, privileges, and protections that alliance with state-sanctioned political power could bring. This is an example of a general issue raised by Jordana yesterday. Irish-born elites would become active members in court politics. English-born men would pick up titles in Ireland and use them to advance themselves in court and office in England. The state, whatever it is, under the Tudors and the early Stuarts, whether we want to call it British or not, seems to have a vital Irish element, read in some ways. And if that makes any sense, then, British state violence in the 16th and early 17th centuries was violence over a sea, but not overseas violence. I also want to suggest in looking at state and violence, we may do ourselves a disservice by operating with too narrow a definition of violence. And this is just me thinking, and now having heard some research, I wonder, whatever. The term seems to me to be being used here this weekend to mean physical harm to the body of a person, be it legally based punishment for a crime committed, a sort of, a kind of back-end use of violence, or a seemingly sort of upfront preemptive violence, such as in the form of torture, against someone to be of criminal interest or intent broadly defined. But this kind of violence was used by kings, nobles, etc., and since who knows when, and it's not clear to me that nobles, kings, nobles, gentry, whatever, acting as agents of legitimate authority based in London, justified their use of violence on their fellow subjects in, say, the 15th century differently than their early modern successors did. In spite of common claims that medieval legitimacy was a matter of might makes right, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find early modern medieval actors claiming justification for what they did simply because they did it because they could. It's unfortunate we don't have a medievalist here, for as Ethan, Krista, and I were briefly discussing yesterday, medievalists, many of them would certainly argue that there was a state in this period. But they're not here to make the case, and so that's one of my issues. One of the other points, might we want to sort of backdate the state and think about violence? Thus, in their absence, I wish to at least think through the question of what was new about the relationship between violence and sanctioned political power in the 16th and 17th centuries, and wonder if one way to approach this might be to think more broadly about what constitutes violence, and to consider if states were able to enact certain types of violence that non-state political actors could not and did not. And I'm sorry, it was a rush through, obviously going a little long here. For instance, we might want to think of violence not only in terms of bodily harm, but also in the various kinds of restraints to movement, action, association, or expression, attacks on property, psychological attack, disruption of cultural norms, and so on and so forth. From there, we might ask whether certain types of violence are in fact peculiar to state authority, and that seeing them in action might help us identify the presence of people acting as state authority, and that seeing them in action might help us identify, and this might help us make this kind of medieval, early modern distinction. For example, would medieval agents of sort of legitimate London-based authority be able to affect the sort of socio-cultural violence visited upon the Gaelic Irish in the 16th and 17th centuries, or Scottish Highlanders and Islanders in the 18th century? I don't know, but it seems that the systematic way in which that violence was carried out was a state matter requiring great logistical coordination on the one hand and legislative backing on the other. Moreover, the frenzy for cultural sameness within the borders of the state seems a peculiar hang-up of 16th century political actors, not one necessarily shared by Plantagenet and Lancastrian dynasts who looked out over a bewilderingly diverse polity. Final point on this, if what I say has any sanity or use, then perhaps we could also think of the notion of law as a form of violence, as opposed to simply an alternative to violence, or at times an instrument of legitimate violence. Finally, I want to question why we assume that violence is the ultimate sanction of state legitimacy. Ultimate, I suppose, is the operative term here. What does that imply? Typically, it seems to be taken to mean that violence is the act of last resort for the modern state. This seems, however, to give too much attention to an ideal type, i.e. actors in a more rational modern state make use of other legitimating factors or languages, and violence retreats into the background as merely the final sanction of that legitimacy, should someone or some group push that legitimacy too far. But could might makes right have a far stronger presence in the early modern than the ideal model would allow? We talked yesterday about how there were frequently competing claims to act with state authority, but we never really discussed how those arguments were settled, or to use the terms of the day, how they were successful. I'd guess it not infrequently they were settled by violence or the threat of it, and thus who could speak for the state was determined not by superior argument, but by superior strength. So, and just some quick examples, any notion of political authority based on conquest, right, rests on this. We might think of sort of Britain in the 1640s and 50s as a moment when sort of victory in the field as a sign of sort of providential legitimacy, puts kind of violence up front as a legitimating factor. On a smaller scale, competition between New English and Gaelic elites in Ireland is one typically won out by violence or is threat. And finally, in the Irish case, we see the situation in which the use of violence, seen as use of violence by people claiming state authority, is the way in which the state actually becomes delegitimated. I hope this is of some use.
Okay.
Yeah.
Am I next? Okay. Okay, what I'm going to say is we're going to leap to the 20th century mostly, but what I'm going to say is going to be very general and very oversimplified, all in the interest of provoking, as I was instructed to do. And I wasn't here yesterday, so I apologize if I sort of rake up things that you've already talked about and disposed of and come to a neat consensus about, as always happens at these conferences. I heard about the panels yesterday. Okay, so when I say I work on the state, I mean that I work on some set of government institutions, the bureaucratic machinery of government. So in the first book, the one with the horrendous subtitle, I worked on the structure of the colonial government in Iraq. And in the second one, the one I'm working on now, I'm working on the home government's machinery of weapons procurement. And so just in what I've looked at myself, I mean, it's pretty obvious to me, at least, that different parts of the state have a different kind of relationship with violence, right? Some departments finance it, others commit it, others provide its instruments. But I still think it's useful to think about the state and the end result of violence as a product of the whole beast, as a reflection of a kind of collective institutional power or a collective dynamic of institutional power. And that's why I think state-making and war-making are such closely linked phenomenon, as John Brewer taught us about the 18th century. But clearly, of course, the state is a highly, clearly the state is, and you can, to different degrees over time, a highly differentiated organism. But I think we can safely argue that by the 18th century, there were a single accountable set of presiding bodies, right? Parliament and the monarchy. And of course, if Parliament is implicated, some significant section of British citizenry is also implicated. So it's very hard to kind of decide where the borders of the state are. But I do think still that government institutions are, as I said, a kind of machinery, that they have their own momentum, their own inertia, their own modes of operation, their own agendas, and that those agendas and ways of operating are only partially in the control of the democracy, however wide that democracy is at any particular moment. And I think that itself is something historical, and you could even make the argument, and I sort of make this argument in the Spies book, that in the 20th century, it's precisely as the state becomes more democratic, it evolves more and more of its own sort of independent spheres in which it can act without the authority of the democracy. So it sort of gathers even more independent institutional power. And I think that's the main point about the state, is that it does have institutional power, which is quite, as I said, simplistic. But I think that's what makes it worth investigating, and that's what makes writing its history something different from writing what we call political history, right? So now, just to get really simple, the most common definition of the state is the Weberian one, right? And I'm sure maybe you guys already talked about this yesterday. And that's the definition that the state is the entity that has a monopoly of violence over a designated territory. And I think, personally, that whether the monopoly is legitimate or not is pretty immaterial. In the case of most colonial states, the claim to legitimacy was certainly constantly contested, often violently. Can you guys hear me with this? Am I using this properly? Okay. Okay. So in the 1980s, Charles Tilley, as Krista mentioned Tilley as well, I think wrote this really interesting article in which he compared the state to organized crime. And in many of the colonies, I think the imperial state was kind of a racketeer, producing both the danger that the subjects faced, and for a price, and what was perceived as an unfair price, also provided the shield against that danger. And I think that's something that's certainly worth thinking about if you want to compare. I mean, to some extent, the state is kind of, even when it's acting within the British Isles, it's sort of a colonizing force, right? It's subduing local rivals. It's kind of a racketeer, except that the price is perceived as much more fair at some point over time, and the dangers that it protects people from are perceived as independent of the state itself. And I think that's might be a useful way to think about the differences between the domestic state and a colonial state in the British context. So one of the questions that Ethan asked us to talk about was how violent was the British state? And my answer to that is, again, is to equivocate and say it depends on when and where. In Britain, I think the easy story is that the state became less physically violent over time, but we all know that prisons, for instance, were in some ways more violent than the corporal punishments that they replaced. And certainly abroad in the empire, violence was often routine, in the form of, political murder, small wars, punitive military actions, penal torture, routine humiliation, forced labor, concentration camps, famine, and so on. In the case of interwar Iraq, which is the case I know best, the British state was as violent, arguably, as any other interwar state of that period. Bombardment was more or less a mode of government and a kind of form of everyday violence. And it was avowedly a form of state terrorism as much as state violence. And the purpose of, these are distinct terms, and I think it might be interesting to talk about their differences. The purpose of state terrorism being broader than simple physical harm to the victim, and the audience is a little bit more important than the immediate victim as well. So English liberalism was no sort of guarantee of nonviolence, at least in the case of 20th century empire. In colonial settings, violence was not necessarily the result of bigger government or more government, but of a different governing style, using a bomb, for instance, where a police baton would be used at home. So it's the same amount of governing, but different technologies are used in its implementation. So in a sense, to get back to the list of questions that Ethan gave us, did everybody get those questions? No? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try and refer to them clearly. He asked us, in a sense, I should have realized that. In a sense, the colony is a kind of state of exception or a state of emergency, I think, in the case of the modern period for Britain. It's a place where the British state is not part of a representative government, and where cultural notions, I think, are really important in justifying departures from domestic norms. So how do we know state violence when we see it? For the purposes of my own work, I prefer to go with the most kind of commonsensical answer, which is that state violence is what you see when you see a lot of people dying before their time because of the actions of state agents. So the deaths of Iraqis under bombardment in the 20s and 30s, as a result of actions of the British Air Force is a very clear-cut case. I think we can all agree. But there are also, of course, more subtle cases like Bengal in 1943, where famine was the result of man-made wartime inflation at a time when price controls and rationing prevented similar circumstances from developing at home. I think state inaction, reneging on the protection racket, in other words, also counts. So, for instance, when police don't do their job during riots. Or when a state actually employs organized crime as a proxy. And a good example of that would be the post-colonial Indian state when they hired gangsters during the anti-Sikh riots of 1984. And it might be worth thinking about, why do post-colonial states use violence in such similar ways to the way the colonial states did. So given the level of British state violence abroad, we were given this quote by Salman Rushdie, which I will read to you since you don't have it. There's a quote by Salman Rushdie: "The trouble with the English is that their history happened overseas, so they don't know what it means." Which is, Rushdie being provocative, and this is me sort of trying to answer that. I do think that quote captures the truth, that the English don't know about their history because it happened overseas, but I think it misses a connection between the overseas history and the fact that the English didn't know it, the fact of ignorance. For instance, in the case of Iraq, the form of the British government at home, the new political fact of mass democracy, crucially shaped the form of the British state in Iraq, which was covert, violent rule by unaccountable arms of government, like intelligence and military agencies. So secret violence was the state's solution to the practical problem of pursuing empire at a moment when the new institution of mass democracy threatened to check it at home. And the Middle East story, I think, points to what is specific about British state violence in colonial settings. One, that it often transpired on the down low, especially in the 20th century, because of the democratic structure of government at home. There would be periodic scandals, right, like the Amritsar massacre, but everyday violence could more or less carry on unchecked. And secondly, that much of that everyday violence was justified by those who did know about it, by people within the state, for instance, by a very sincere belief that that sort of violence was civilizing and even, perversely to us, humanitarian. And you can see this, for instance, in the invention of concentration camps during the Boer Wars, which my student Eden Forth is working on, and in the use of bombardment in Iraq as well. So the importance of the state officials having a clear conscience, I think, is a kind of distinctively British preoccupation. In general, I think the British certainty that their violence was distinctive is itself distinctive. The certainty that the British Empire was anchored by a kind of unique ethical scrupulousness. So in short, what's distinctive about British state violence is is almost our forgetting that there was any, which is itself, as I mentioned earlier, a product of the democratic structure at home, which created these new spaces of kind of secret state action. Somehow the assumption was, and I think still is, perhaps not in this room, that liberalism was a kind of prophylactic against state violence, and you can see this in the writings of Orwell or Hannah Arendt or whatever. But in fact, to take just for instance the interwar doctrine of minimal force, right? It actually, in fact, depended on the liberal use of force. It was a call for state terrorism, using exemplary violence to produce generalized terror, not any kind of disavowal of violence itself. yes, the British didn't like a fully manned garrison state, but it was the manpower, not the violence, that they objected to. And colonial states were, more or less essentially militarized. So one question, just to close with, that I hope we can talk about is the material connection between state violence and modern industrial and commercial life, or modernity, if you want to call it that. In this new project I'm working on, which is on the 18th century, I'm looking at the state acquisition of the instruments of violence, specifically guns. And the state was one among many customers of this privately manufactured proto-industrial commodity, but it was a critical bulk purchasing customer of that commodity. Its insatiable demand for guns, as well as for clothing, buttons, hats, candles, coal, horses, food, and so on, for the near continuous warfare of the 18th century, raises, I think, the question of the role of state violence in the economic transformations of the period. Can we, for instance, talk about the 18th century industrial world as actually part of a kind of proto-military industrial complex? I think this might be another way of relating British state violence abroad to the relationship between state and society at home. So in other words, in the 18th century, what did the collective investment in the state through taxes, through supplying provisions for war, do to the nature of state violence? I think we know a lot about the relationship between the British economy and private forms of violence like slavery, but not about its connection to other more state-led forms of violence. So I hope we can talk about that.
Well, when there's something really odd about this, the topic for this panel, right? State and violence in the state, because at some point it seems that the state does nothing, and here, in a sense, nothing but. I mean, the state is and does nothing but violence in a sense. You can talk about state and religion, state and economy. But it seems the state seems to be doing, in a sense, nothing else. Now, another sort of, before I get to my comments about it, I was very sympathetic to Mike's comments yesterday about the state, although my question came as a contentious rather than supportive. But I think the logical conclusion of thinking about the dispersed, if you like, nature of the state and where it is invoked and so forth is that and here I sort of agree with the literature that came, from Foucault and came out of his work, in the sense, what sense does it make to actually talk about the state rather than the activity of government? But we're here to talk about the state, so I'm going to pretend that we actually know, what the state is, and try to see what are the sort of type of questions that come out of it. And the other half of this panel, violence, and I'm going to take a very crude, purposefully again, a very crude notion of violence. Of course, one can, and you guys have elaborated on that. Question the usefulness of a narrow definition of violence, but so one of the points I want to make is about how the execution of violence influenced the character and contours, if you like, of the British state. I'm gonna in the modern period. If we take Brewer's account, the military fiscal state, we have instead of a state that was the idea that there was sort of a state. Corelli Barnett talked about the 18th century state as a state that was withering away. We have an idea of a strong, modern, rational state that emerged in the 18th century that was essentially good in doing two things. It was good in collecting taxes and good in waging wars. So when you think about the growth of the state after the military fiscal state, we have all kinds of state that historians talk about: the laissez-faire state, the liberal state, the welfare state, what have you. It seems that sort of the story of violence is not if you like, the central theme. When we talk about the story of state expansion, there's literature on the revolution and government, or before that, Dicey, McDonough, and again, they're talking about forms of government, not on the state, but that is where essentially, so the literature is. So this kind of literature shifts our attention from the violent nature of the 19th century British state. And in that sense, I think David Edgerton's revision for the 20th century, which comes out as a kind of a very, it's the only voice, more or less, suggesting that debates about the 20th century state focused either on welfare or on decline, actually excluded the discussion of the fact that the British state was very good in the production and management of violence. And we don't really have that sort of story for the 19th century state. One way to ask what does the state do is to ask what is the state spending money on. And again, these are very, thinking about that raises questions again about what we talked yesterday. Where is the state and the sort of the local and the national? But in general, you can see where the expenditure on what we might call civil projects really start to become the significant expenditure of the state was on issues related to violence until the Edwardian period, when you see that sort of civil expenditure starts to, if you look at the table, sort of start to take off as it were, and that was also a result of a kind of a colonial strategic calculus of national decline, the Boer War, deterioration of the race, and so forth. And it is possible that because that's when those stories about the formation of the civil state actually started to form, that we have this optical illusion. That's when these debates actually emerged. At the time when expenditure, when the state started to do also other things. Now the second point has to do with sort of the relation between violence and the state in arenas which are less directly connected to violence. On the one hand, the British state, we can see, was very efficient in certain things related to the maintenance and production of violence, and I'm talking about the 20th century here. During World War I, regulating the home front, certain movements towards securing industrial peace, production. One can think of the Second World War efforts at the Ministry of Aircraft Production, but these were actually limited arenas, and in many other arenas where we tend to think about the age of total war as this time when the British state started to expand, it's really interesting to see how it was extremely reluctant, and here I'm giving agency to the state, to expand, to fulfill in a sense these promises that were made in the name of sacrifice. Often it was these forms of expansion were the result of pressures of organizations that we can locate essentially within civil society. A lot of these things that are related to sort of the moral terrain of war, regulation of morals that emerged during war. One can talk, regulation of food is another example. A lot of these, we can see the state sort of invited or pressured upon, invoked, what have you, by the state. Again, issues, and the state was actually reluctant to mandate. One example is the issue of industrial productivity. It's somehow, when it was, somehow the idea was accepted, the forms of joint consultation are indeed vital for securing greater productivity. The state was actually reluctant to mandate the creation of forms of joint consultation, except in certain government establishments. So the state will move in, but also, but again, I want to in a very limited way, and it is possible that this reluctance of the state to expand during the age of total war actually explains why afterwards this expansive state actually lasted so briefly. And the last point I want to I want to talk about is there is a kind of the seeming non-violent nature of the British state, which is something that has been raised here by everybody, and part of it has to do with the seeming remoteness and visibility of the instruments of violence. And my work on the army was always this kind of small parochial institution. Soldiers, as Wellington called them, were the scum of the earth. Liberal MP Holmes in the late 19th century could explain that there was nothing more outside British society than the army. Of course, this is the army that throughout the 19th century fought in the colonies. There was actually not 1 year right during Victoria's reign that Britain was not involved in battle. But when we come also to the 20th century, the instruments of we have to the instruments of violence. And I think that relates to Priya's work and relates to Edgerton's work, are in a sense becoming more, quote unquote, indirect. It has to do a lot with technology, and you have all these army officers and commanders complaining about the neglect of the army. And in a sense, they were right. The army was neglected because the state was executing, but this does not mean that the state was sort of pulling away from violence. And one last point has to do with, if we're talking about the state, we sort of have to talk about civil society, and we cannot talk, and the relation between the military practices, or what you can call militaristic practices that expand from the army to civil society in the 19th century, in a sense, again, are related to, will come into fruition later in the 20th century. But we can talk about that later. So,
thank you. Terrific. That was you were all dutifully provocative. Although the really provocative thing would have been to say that the British state was incredibly unviolent. But it seems to me that there are a number of issues that you all had in common. One is the question of how it is that we define and think about state violence, if there's a type of continuum that we want to capture. Another issue seemed to be about the reach of state violence and its difference domestically and imperially. And then you were all worrying about the question of legitimacy and legitimation and how that changes differently, operates differently over time. The one question that I think that I would have to the panel is to think about how it is that we would think about change over time. That's to say, you're all terrific in terms of your own specific areas, but we need to have a sense of what is changing in terms of the state's relationship to violence. Priya ended by talking about modern industrial technologies. Daniel also just ended on talking about that. So I'd like to get a sense from you all whether you see it not just be a question of the rise or fall of violence, but actually the transformation in the nature of state violence. And then we'll open it up to the floor.
Well, I don't know who wants to go first, but I'll suggest that the comments about the hidden nature of state violence, or the need to hide state violence, that is perhaps something that we can see progressing in a fairly linear fashion over time. Even if we're talking about internal violence, violence against subjects at home, there is, over time, a need to keep that hidden. So by the 1800s, obviously, we all know capital punishment moves indoors. fewer people are executed, they're executed in private. Now, of course, so in some ways this makes the state seem less violent, but that very process allows the state to punish more people through prisons and whatnot. But there does seem to be a need to exhibit a less violent face in that respect. And this is obviously something you've talked about in the colonial context, the need for violence that can be hidden or disavowed, done at a lower level, by whether it's by prison guards or by prisoners themselves or things like this. So perhaps a growing sense of a need to disavow violence, to distance oneself from violence, but yet at the same time a greater ability to exert violence more effectively, more efficiently.
Any of the rest of you want to comment on
I can try. I mean, I think, for me, what's really important about the state is that it is, a set of materially existing institutions, and I think, it has a physical existence and shape. And if the question is, I'm not answering the question, how did it change over time, but how would we think about how it changed over time? I think it might, just to be very kind of commonsensical about it is, trace that physical evolution of it. And, the implications of that physical evolution may be different. Like a larger state may imply, less, I'm not saying they're all going to be kind of linear relationships, but there is a way, I think, or secular trends of any kinds. But I do think that if we're going to think about change over time, the physical structure of it does change over time. And that seems sort of a easy in.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose the one thing I attempted to put out there about exactly this sort of change over time was that violence as a sort of political act, or some element of political power is I suppose timeless, but perhaps there are different types of violent acts associated with the interest of a nation or a state that we may not see in the medieval period. Thus, sort of my suggestion that maybe if you think about internal clearances and Anglicization and the sort of violence upon which that's based, kind of broadly defined, that might be something that is as a sort of a sign of of change over time.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, again, I'm not going to answer about how we change from the early modern to the modern, but in the modern period, and part of the story has to do with what is sort of what seems more feasible and what seems more legitimate. I mean, how much what kind of army you can raise. And why suddenly, using violence with technology, can be mobilized by the state as something that is, cheaper in terms of manpower. You see the difference definitely between sort of the two wars. The ability to rely on a citizen army seems to.
Okay, questions from the floor, and we need the microphone. Who has the microphone? Here it comes. Dun, 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 dun. So we'll go Jordana, then Ethan, then Steve. And Brian had his hand up too? Okay.
Thanks. Well, I really appreciated this panel. I thought it was very fruitful. And I also think that it really advanced in some interesting ways the conversation we had yesterday about where was the state, because it seems like in thinking about violence in the state, you all had to have recourse to that issue. Well, it depends on where you look, right? I mean, the big divide was, to echo James, between the metropole and the colony, but also in Krista's case, between London and the rest of Britain, right? That the state is going to look more or less violent depending on where you localize it. So I found that very useful. But in thinking about this question of the divide between types of violence we see at home and abroad. I mean, I wanted to ask Brendan to elaborate on some of the very interesting distinctions he made between the violence in Ireland being subject-on-subject violence, and also how it was violence over a sea, but not overseas violence. I think these were provocative and interesting distinctions, but I'd like to hear more about them. And I'm thinking about colonial violence, if we could loop this back to the question of sources and archives somewhat, is colonial violence actually more extensive and of a different kind than metropolitan violence, Or because it's so at odds with the civilizing mission, do we just hear more about it? I mean, it's interesting because the term covert came up a few times, or that colonial violence is kind of on the down low, but we're able to know an incredible amount about colonial violence. I mean, in some ways we might think of it as being sort of over-documented rather than suppressed. The knowledge of those violent episodes is in fact really magnified in certain types of sources compared to maybe everyday violence in the metropole that might be more easily overlooked. So I'm wondering if that violence is actually, do you see it really of being on a different scale and of a different type, or is it also related to the ways that we find out about that type of violence and the degree of scandal it arouses and the degree of reaction or resistance that it engenders? I'll turn the microphone over to Ethan.
Yeah, no,
Go ahead and
respond,
answer,
and
yeah.
then we'll take
Do you
the
want to
question.
answer the overseas?
Sure, I can. Or I can at least speak to it, whether or not I can actually answer it. But I think it's worthwhile remembering that there's a distinction made after 1541, when Ireland's made a kingdom, and this is something which is ratified by Parliament. To that point, the Gaelic Irish are seen as squatters and interlopers, right? And they're termed the king's Irish, the king's enemies, right? King's Irish enemies. From that point onward, they're seen as subjects, right? With the sorts of rights and protections and privileges that come with attachment to the London-centered administration. And what's quite curious about this is that not only Anglo-Norman, but lots of Gaelic Irish, elites sort of come into the state in order to ally themselves with it. And therefore, they're no longer sort of outsiders in some kind of colonial context and, at least read in some constitutional way, but rather are subjects to the crown. And therefore, when, you have actors in Ireland sort of acting violently upon one another, that's an aspect of internal violence that one doesn't see in, the Caribbean or Kenya or Iraq or some such thing like that. And if that's the case, and again, I mean, is that the British state? Is that some kind of multiple monarchy? I don't know. But it certainly does seem to, internal colonial, I'm not sure. But it seems to be, it is a situation in which people who believe that they were under the protection of the state to which they were allied have found out that that protection, in fact, was not the case. So, I do think that people are very intimidated by water, sort of like, it's like ghosts, like, can't go across. But I'm not entirely sure that works politically or in terms of sort of state activity. So that's why I said it's over AC, but it's not overseas. People consistently appeal to the king, to the courts of London and so on and so forth. So anyway, that was just my suggestion.
I thought your question was so interesting that, it made me realize it doesn't just, when we were talking about where is the state, but I think we need to talk about where are we talking about the state, because I think your view that that we know much more about colonial violence is it's because, you're in this room. I think most people out there are surprised. Like the Carolyn Elkins book, on the concentration camps in Kenya was so controversial and so questioned, in terms of, even the claims that it makes. I think perhaps, I don't know how much consensus there is in this room, but I'm willing to wager that the majority of us, are sympathetic to the argument that there was a lot of colonial violence. But I think out there, outside of this room, and that it was a bad thing, right? And outside of this room, I don't think either of those two are kind of guaranteed. So I don't know if we know more. But that said, I do think we know about certain episodes of colonial violence. For instance, I mentioned the Amritsar massacre, and then everyone knows about Morant Bay, right, in Jamaica, and there are these scandals, right? But that sometimes leaves us with the impression that the rest of the time, but for the Amritsar massacre, the British were not terribly, terribly violent in India. And I think that's a very misleading notion. And I actually don't think that a lot of this, like for instance with the stuff that I did on Iraq, the sources are not actually really there. A lot of what I found out was through extrapolation. There were no sources kept. There were no statistics gathered on exactly what the results. This is stuff that people in London did not really want to know too much about, and not gathering information was kind of tactically, useful for them to keep those consciences as clear as they always were. So I don't think that the sources are necessarily better on colonial violence. I do think that suddenly in the last maybe 10 years, people are more interested in the idea of colonial violence, but it's certainly not, I think, a mainstream view outside of the subset of this profession of British history. And I do think whether it's a different kind of violence from what you see at home. I mean I wouldn't say that the hand of the state was heavier abroad than it was at home. In many ways, I think you could argue the opposite. But the technologies that they used, I mean, they had a lot less, like, for instance, they could ask a lot less of their subjects abroad because they had so much less legitimacy, right? The state had that much less legitimacy. So, for instance, the demands made on the upper classes during World War II in India were much less than the demands made of British upper classes, right? But when it came to, taking any kind of disciplinary action, the technologies you could use abroad were much more different and usually much more brutal than what you would use at home. At home, you might throw people in prison or, but you wouldn't bombard them or machine gun them or something. So I think that's where the difference is. Technology, I think, is really important.
Just a footnote to that. I was just thinking when you were having this discussion, I know of 3 protesters who were shot by the British government in the interwar period in Britain. I wouldn't even begin to be able to count how many people are killed overseas in acts of political violence by the state.
No,
Yeah.
So my intention in the question is not to equalize the violence that's happening in the metropolitan and the colonies, and obviously there is a difference of scale and, as you say, of technology. But I wonder if part of the distinction that needs to be theorized, and it sounds like your new work, Priya, is aimed towards this, is not between metropolitan and colonial violence, but also of different forms of colonial violence, including the relationship between the exceptional and the everyday. Because I agree that most of the scholarship on colonial violence has been about, it's sort of exposés, right? It's about these moments of exceptional violence or apparently exceptional violence.
When the myth of good colonial governance was punctured, and then they put it all back together again. But the main thing is that that is a myth, right? That colonial governance was always inherently violent. The rule of law was itself violent.
Right? Yeah, right? And I think Elizabeth Kolsky's new work is precisely about this, right? The link between the rule of law and everyday violence in British India. So I think that's just another component of this this question of where was violence in the state that could be theorized further.
I saw Brendan wanting to say something.
Yeah, that's okay.
Well, I was thinking about this question of the relationship between the sort of punctuated and the everyday as in terms of change over time, and James's question. And it struck me that a major innovation in state violence is the introduction of domestic police forces, first the Metropolitan Police Force and then throughout the country, and that this, in Krista's image of London sort of with bodies hanging everywhere in the 16th century, that's really cheap. And it's about punctuated moments of exemplary force. Police are much more expensive, but they provide constant, daily, quotidian force and the sort of violence of the state, walking through neighborhoods all the time. And so that's maybe something we could think about is this personnel and the ability of the state, that alongside the creation of bureaucracy, the state creates quotidian violence, and those two things are very connected. That then led me to scribble down here, state violence is a process of securing peace. And it struck me that as we were talking about what makes state violence somehow distinct or unique. This is the great Hobbesian paradox, right? That people think about Hobbes as a scholar a theorist of absolute power, but he saw himself as a theorist of peace, and that this is the only way you can create peace, through a state that's capable of this sort of untrammeled violence. And it struck me that all the things that you are all talking about as examples of state violence all are the sort of flip side of arguments for how to produce peace, and that might be, a sort of key into what makes interpersonal violence different and what makes state violence so sort of sordid and difficult to get hold of.
The comments about policing, I think, come back to your earlier comments about the economics, the material history of these institutions. I mean, arguably at earlier points in British history, the states just simply couldn't afford this sort of investment. So, as Elias and others have suggested, the monopolies of violence and taxation are intimately interconnected. It's as one develops, it strengthens the other, and so forth. So that would be part of the story you're talking about here, I think. And certainly the state violence as an agent of peace. I mean, we do see a rather striking trajectory in British history over these years, the decline of interpersonal violence, more so from the mid-17th century, I think, than from the 16th century, really, but a dramatic decline in the mid-17th century. And Elias and others have suggested that is precisely because that's when the state takes hold. It has developed to a point that it does have a more effective control over violence. And forgetting some of the psychological theories he advances, I mean, it's this basic idea that as people can predict more effectively the sort of violence they're likely to encounter because of state control of that violence, they can then restrain their own actions. And this fits in with what evolutionary psychologists and others have suggested about the relationship between violence. So yes, but you also have this odd fact that interpersonal violence is declining domestically, that the really public exemplary acts of brutal state violence are decreasing domestically, while at the same time the war-making abilities of the state are increasing exponentially.
I just wanted to read you guys a quote that I love from Orwell, and I think he may have been thinking about what's going on in the Middle East when he wrote this. It was between the wars. He said, defenseless villages are bombarded from the air, the inhabitants driven out into the countryside, the cattle machine-gunned, the huts set on fire with incendiary bullets, and this is called pacification. Right? I mean, that's the ultimate kind of contradiction of the British colonial state.
These two have got the mic, Steve, so I'm going to let them ask the questions first, and then you can. But I'm delighted to see a hand going up in the back of the room. I was just about to remind you that the room doesn't actually stop.
We can see you.
3 rows back, and I can see you, and I would be delighted to hear from you.
Yeah, I'd like to raise the question of torture, because I think that it is a very interesting example of the state as an arbiter of the use of violence, the subject that you raised, Krista. And also, I think it provides evidence about the willingness of the state to suppress or hide the use of violence. And it's a very complicated study in England because from a very early date, English prided themselves on the fact that their courts did not torture, unlike those terrible French across the channel. I mean, you get this in Fortescue. And there is a very strict prohibition of the use of torture in English courts. In other words, judges or courts could not torture. But the state felt that it needed to torture under certain circumstances. So what you get from the mid-16th to the mid-17th century are all those torture warrants in cases where the state is threatened. And they are it's not judicial torture because it's not at the order of judges, but it is at the order of the Privy Council, which of course is another agent of the state. And there's a really interesting commentary on this in Blackstone a century later, where he says that torture is not an instrument of the law, but of the state. Now, of course, you might argue that, well, the law is an instrument of the state, the Privy Council is an instrument of the state, so maybe that is a false distinction. But there's another example of this, and that is that if you look at the Council of the Marshes of Wales, in the 16th century, where there is a problem of resistance to the state that's greater than other parts of England, you have, and that's an agency of the Privy Council, it's an offshoot of the Privy Council, they have a right to torture. And they keep this right into the, actually it's into 1660 if I'm not mistaken. So again, you have, and then the other example is when you look at, you look at Scotland, which continues to torture, and then eventually the British government and then when you have a British state in 1708, they prohibit the use of torture. Finally there, because once again they're trying to impose English ideals on Scotland, and then what happens after that is that you get this disguised form of torture, and maybe what we can talk about then is the continued use of torture in areas outside of the British Isles, which are authorized by the state. And you still get, on the one hand, these denials that we certainly can understand today when we say we don't torture, and yet we know we torture, but we torture through rendition overseas. We don't torture within the state. So in the colonial state, perhaps you have torture, but you still have a very strict prohibition, which sort of reflects the humanitarian standards, or so-called humanitarian standards of the state. Of course, the reason they didn't torture in the courts isn't because they were humanitarian. I mean, and they certainly were violent, and you could see that in the punishments. But it was simply because they didn't need confessions, as you did in the continents, because of the law of proof. So anyway, it just seems that it's a wonderful example of what you were talking about as the state being the arbiter of the use of torture. In other words, you can do it under certain circumstances, and perhaps covertly, and perhaps in peripheral areas, but not in England.
Yeah, I think torture in the 16th century is a fascinating topic for so many reasons. I mean, for one, yes, as you point out, the English very often prided themselves on the lack of torture, but yet studies of the continent suggest that execution rates were much lower there, in part because of torture, because you had to get the confession, and so if an individual was able to, so it's not that it was less violent, you have more individuals tortured, but fewer executed. In England, we can skip the torture and just kill them. So there's that odd feature of it. And of course, the definitions of exceptional moments at which torture is allowed, threats to the state, becomes very loose. Initially it's religious dissidents, things like this, but then it comes to be rioters, and it's much more expansively used. So it's not just modern historians who have an increasingly expansive notion of politics. Tudor torturers did as well. And arguably some of this stuff is first practiced in Ireland, and the ideas are brought back, and certainly later in the colonial context. I mean, I think after, so much of the 20th century writing about torture, or mid-20th century writing about torture, was influenced by the revelations from colonial context. It challenged this notion that, we were beyond torture, that this was not something that civilized societies did. Algeria and these other sorts of things really disrupted that notion. So there's no longer any nice teleological story of torture, and that's something that we're all sort of dealing with in different ways. But
yeah, it sort of reminds me, because in the British Army, when this whole debate about flogging emerged in the 19th century, they also look, we flog our soldiers, but we don't kill them like everybody else on the continent. And it also relates. I mean, you raised the police. One can also think of other sort of institutions that sort of to keep the. What about prisons? In this respect, are these institutions of violence? I think we're still kind of looking. When we talk about violence, somehow we recognize its porous nature or whatever, but we're still looking for those moments of. One of the questions that you circulated was, how do you know violence? How do you know it's violence when you see it, or something like that? We're still looking for those kind of exceptional moments, in a sense, or use of force, but although we question.
Okay, Mike has the mic. Oh, sorry, Brendan.
No, I just wonder if maybe torture comes a bit into the British game when the state gets involved in the religion game, right? And it seems to me, where do you see torture most frequently throughout the medieval period, right? It's in sort of various inquisitions, right? And that's sort of the protection of a sort of abstracted, almost kind of orthodoxy that you don't really see in English politics and British politics until you get some slightly more abstracted state or national interests. And I wonder if there are sort of overlaps there that we might see with religion in the state and violence in the state, and torture being a sort of one of the moments in which you can sort of see those intersections or interweaving.
Just one thing, and that is that many of those torture warrants are torture Catholic priests.
Yeah, precisely.
In the 15th century.
Yeah. So I mean, in thinking of the change across time that James suggests, this might be one of the ways in.
Mike has the mic.
I found Krista's corrective extremely valuable about the presence of violence and the normality of violence in the early modern state, and it's a kind of corrective to a school of history in early modern that I'm associated with in negotiation and participation and so forth, and I think it's a very important corrective. What I wanted to, though, suggest, and it's not just a kind of internal to Tudor-Stuart history, it's a way of approaching the question of change over time, is that we could think about state violence as a resource which people try to deploy for their own purposes, because these body parts all over London are the parts of people's bodies who represented a threat to property, and they're not there because the state wants them there. They're there because someone's accused them, a jury's allowed the accusation to go forward, a jury's willing to see the prosecution go through to the point of state murder. And so one way of thinking about that is not the state exercising violence in all these ways, but state providing a means by which people can secure violent resources to pursue their own ends, which are then not themselves subject to any violent sanction. I can get someone killed. Yeah. And that, it seems to me, over the long term, is another way of thinking about how the relationship between the state and violence operates. Firstly, what forms of violence are available as a collective resource. Bombing is not available to the Tudor state, so you can tell a narrative.
Thank God.
In that kind of, they would have known what to do with it, for sure. They had plans, no question. So the technology changes, but also the groups that are securing the use of force and how they're securing the use of force. And there again, I think the colonial bombings are interesting, because I don't think there's an early modern equivalent of the bombs, but also of the groups of foreign policy experts who define the problem of government in these overseas colonies, come up with the solution of bombing, and also then protect that set of decision-making from any democratic oversight or overview. And I think think of it as a collective resource that can be deployed, and then how that resource varies over time and how people secure its use is one way of narrating violence, which escapes some of the restrictions of thinking that the state somehow wants to do this and is able to get away with it or not.
And I tried to suggest that when saying that, it's not just a simple state-society binary, that this is a resource that people draw upon. It's just, yes, I would agree.
I wanted to add something, I think, responds a little to what you said and to the earlier discussion about torture, and that is that I think these are connected histories. It's not a coincidence that there are different kinds of uses of violence in the colonies, and just precisely when the state disavows corporal punishment increasingly at home. They're connected histories. I mean, torture was used for punishment in many of the colonies, and I think I don't know if anyone has done this research, but it might be interesting to find out, for instance, some of the countries that are used for rendition, like Egypt. I mean, they evolved as police states under the British, and it's not a coincidence, I think, that they still employ tactics. It's very likely, I think, that it's an institutional continuity with the past. But in any case, as I was saying, that the decline in the use of torture at home is, I think, related to the fact that it continued in the colonies. And there's this great book that came out last year called Death by 1,000 Cuts. I don't know if anyone saw it, about Ling Chi in China. It has like 5 authors, so I can't remember their names. But it was how the West became so obsessed with this punishment of Ling Chi, which was death. I mean, it was mythologized in Europe as death by 1,000 cuts, an execution practice in China, and how this became such an obsession amongst various types of intellectuals and even artists in Western Europe, and that it really informed the discussion about torture at home. So it's like it's part of the history of Orientalism, right? To define yourself against the others. So the more that they witness torture abroad and exaggerate and mythologize it, it leads to the 18th century kind of civilizing of punishment and home. But at the same time, those sites abroad are maintained as exceptions, right, for when the Europeans actually go out there and set up their own penal institutions there. So I just think we should remember that they are connected.
Okay, great. Yeah, Steve, I know it's been very patient, but I want to get these other people. So you at first, and I've forgotten your name?
James.
Is it Richard? No. Bob, okay. No, Steve, you're going first, but I'm just getting their names so that they go next. Riyadh and Jeff.
James, maybe we should have several questions.
Okay, thank you for that suggestion.
Provide several. No, I have nothing further to add.
Well, I have about 10, but I'll limit myself. Yeah.
You're limited to 1 or 2.
Okay, well, it depends how you count, and I know quantification isn't a strength at Berkeley, so we'll just
Well, thank you, Steve.
Well, you're part of campus quantification. I guess I will limit myself to 2. I mean, there's a longer discussion I'd like to have with Krista because I think it's a very useful suggestion. But I also struck me that there was some tension between what you said about your change over time and what you said about Elias, and it struck me that in fact they run in exactly opposite directions. But that's a longer question. So the first question is really directed, I suppose, to Priya, but also sort of follows on a bit from Mike's question. It does strike me that there is a Janus Face notion of your presentation. And the Janus Face, I mean, the thing that I want to highlight here is the fundamentally, quintessentially liberal assumption of the autonomy of the state, which underlies this. That is to say, you described it as an area in which there will be no politics, and that strikes me as a sort of because your position is that the politics is actually the debate over legitimacy which occurs elsewhere, and that what you're doing is creating these insulated institutions which are to sort of private. And it strikes me that strikes me as a sort of fundamental assumption of liberal state theorists. And it's something that's contested by non-liberal state theorists, as George Steinmetz's son strikes me remarkably well. But it strikes me that, in fact, you describe precisely why that isn't the case, and this sort of gets me a bit to sort of fitting with Mike, is that in fact, the fact that you're describing that there's these contests over whether the legitimacy of the violence in the colonies or elsewhere is precisely a political question. And it strikes me that Mike's, the sort of logical conclusion that one could take from Mike's intervention is not that that these things take place in private, but that the site of where the political contestation takes place changes. And that strikes me as the narrative of change over time. The second question, and I sort of really want to sort of push Brendan a bit on this notion of a radical contrast between Ireland and elsewhere, because I think the insight about redefining this state as something other than an English state and pointing out is absolutely right. But it doesn't strike me that that's fundamentally different from the nature of the West Indies in the 18th century, for example. Again, you have a complete interpenetration among the elites. You also have much more humble people moving back and forth, as we're now learning. And we also have the violence in Jamaica, in Barbados, the sort of interpersonal violence, which then spills over into debates in England in the 18th century. So it does strike me that there's a real continuity and that there isn't a distinction between over the sea and overseas. In fact, it's exactly the sort of same sort of contest which is goes on well into the 18th century. I mean, that's what I know about confidently. But I think if you sort of put some pressure on this conceptualization and read beyond 1640, things look a little bit different.
Do you want to go first, or should I?
We're going to take a series of questions. I can see David. I can see David looking at me, and he's in charge of my pay rise this year. So we're going to go that way.
There's the power of the state.
So we'll take 3. It's already going down.
We're never going to hear the end of that one.
We're going to take 3 or 4 questions, okay, and then I'm going to give all of the people on the panel a chance to respond, and then if you feel like your question hasn't been satisfactorily answered and I'm not making them do that, then you can stand up and have another go, okay?
Violence.
So Bob.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to kind of have a comment on the 20th century, and particularly with regards to the divide between violence domestically in Britain and then also violence in the colonies. And I think there's too sharp of a divide being driven between that. I think that there's quite a bit more violence domestically in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Great Britain, and this goes directly to the issue of the police that was brought up earlier. I think that you think of English bobbies, and you always assume that they're walking around without guns, writing out traffic tickets and helping cats down from trees. But in the early 20th century, they walked around with guns. They spent their times, cracking the heads of anarchists and Fenian bomb-throwing terrorists. And there's also a great deal of evidence in the 20th century that a lot of the colonial police who retired from the service or had to leave because of decolonization actually went back to Great Britain and became English bobbies and took a lot of their tactics with regards to dealing with rioters and whatnot, and applied that to urban strife in Great Britain. So I think that there's more continuity between the domestic scene and the colonies as well. Who should I pass to next?
Riyadh.
I want to address James' question about change over time, and I'm wondering, it seems that the Weberian definition of the state's been an obstacle to thinking about the colonial and the metropolitan governments or states in a common field, and that maybe what we need to do is probe the question of legitimacy and what legitimacy means both over time and in different kinds of geographical contexts. So when Ranjit Guha writes about the colonial state as a dominance without hegemony, he's got a different idea about what legitimacy is in a colonial state situation than in the metropole as such. So maybe this question, what is legitimacy, both over space, over time, helps us to think about the specificities of violence over space and over time, and of the state as well.
Can you just give it to Maura behind you, and then
mine follows on his question, because I'm also interested in the normalcy of violence, normalizing violence, right? Which I think, and trying to think about this in relationship to democratization, because at some level there's this acceptance in a part of civil society. And I thought that Priya and Daniel did a really wonderful job sort of tying those connections between, just making concrete what the state is and thinking about civil society. But I'm thinking about, some awful things that were done in the 1960s in Northern Ireland, and the way in which the civil rights demonstrators argued about the state killing them for disagreeing with them, right? So in a sense, they evoke this idea about the state, but the state was represented how? In the British Army. And so I'm just, trying to sort of maybe push you guys to give me some ideas about that. And this sense in which, clearly some of this was known, right? This is not hidden, what went on there. And yet this is, a sort of the peaceable kingdom, hardly. But that's just sort of haunting to me when they use that word, the state, the state might throw you in prison for disagreeing with it, but you don't get killed for disagreeing with the state in 1969, 1970. Anyway.
Okay, we have Becky and Jeff waiting in the wings, but I'm actually going to let people respond, because otherwise it's going to get, your questions will get lost.
Should I go?
Sure.
Okay. Well, first to take Steve's question. So the problem with gathering questions is that you sort of forget what. So I've written down. I'm questioning your legitimacy, David. Okay. Your judgment. Your judgment. Why do you listen to him? Okay. Okay. So you were talking about the autonomy of the state, right? And that I was saying there was no politics with it. And to an extent, that is what I said. But as I also said, my get out of jail free card is that I was dramatically oversimplifying deliberately. And of course, I agree that there are politics within the state, and there are really important political divisions among the personnel of the state. But I do think that, and I think this is something historical. It's not the same across time, but there are ways in which, regardless of political struggles going on in the wider polity, and in certain areas of the state like parliament, or elections, those political processes, I think certainly when you get into the 20th century, some parts of the state do have a kind of autonomy, and we saw this happening. And the American government is not, I think, dramatically different. And I mean, there's some interesting similarities, I think, in the 20th century. And we saw that come out in the discussion about groupthink, for instance, right, where in certain spaces of the state, whatever the political divisions are, there's a kind of just way of operating and a kind of inertia. And for me, what this means is not that that politics has no purchase on the state, but that democracies, ought to be. This sounds so prescriptive. There's like sort of an obligation of democracies to be that much more vigilant about exercising some kind of political purchase on the state. So which is what motivates me to study the state. Is if you know the nature of the beast, and how little the democratic purchase is on the state, you will be hopefully that much more vigilant. And I hope I understood and answered that question properly. But to get to Bob's question, which I thought was fantastic, thank you so much for asking that. I think you're absolutely right. There are a lot of similarities between, especially in the 19th and 20th century, especially in the late 20th century, between violence at home and violence abroad. And I think you put your finger exactly on the spot. It's a lot of it is the common personnel. I mean, Hugh Trenchard, who was the head of the Air Force that designed the air control program in Iraq, came back home and headed up the Metropolitan Police. And you can imagine what kind of, he was a visionary, right, for Iraq. So, I mean, there's obviously an important legacy for that at home as well. So, I think, E.P. Thompson talked about this too in the 50s and 60s when he talked about the secret state, and he also made that same case that all these guys are coming back home and bringing their kind of police mentality here, and I think you definitely see manifestations of that. So I just would say I agree with you absolutely. I think that's it. I'll pass it to everybody else. Sorry, Maura, I didn't.
Let me try to respond to Steve. The lame answer is, I think that's right, that beyond the 1640s, I think it's much. There's a chronological window in which I think my argument might work more strongly than it does at other points. But let me at least attempt to push some of the distinctions, since I suppose that should be my job, right? One, from the perspective of the Irish themselves, they certainly don't see themselves as colonials. And so one of the things that they're attempting to work out, whether they're secular lords or they're intellectuals, is how their relationship, a long-standing relationship with a sort of superior authority, has sort of gone sour. That doesn't seem to me. So, for example, just thinking about this kind of Irish and Indians kind of thing, like if you look at Dan Richter's book on facing east from Indian country, you could never do a facing east from after 1541, I don't think you could really do a sort of, facing east from Gaelic country. I mean, you could, but it wouldn't be a discussion of trying to deal with the kind of intellectual or kind of cultural dislocation of contact and difference. Related to that, I suppose following on from that, there's a very long, very long on the elite level, but I also think there's probably movement sort of below that I just don't know that much about. Very long relationship and interaction between Irish elites and English elites. And then there's periodic, and we can certainly argue as to what extent this is sincere or not, but there's certainly a long tradition of the performance of ritual submission by Gaelic lords to the monarchy in London. And in fact, much of the move for surrender and regrant actually comes from people on the ground, Gaelic types, and Anglo-Norman types who have sort of gone native, who wish to align themselves with the state. So St. Ledger, who's the character who puts this together, it's not as if he kind of wakes up and figures this out one day, but he's picking up on language which is out there. And therefore, I think one of the things that's different then about what's going on in Ireland versus what's going on in, say, the West Indies is simply the direction of the dynamic. Whereas in the West Indies, you start out in a situation of the direction is, from distance to proximity, right? This is really kind of cultural contact, right? How do you navigate difference, and how do you get sort of acculturation and so on and so forth, and then how does that work out? Whereas in Ireland, it seems as if you start out from a situation of proximity and very strong points of contact and move towards one that seems to be dominated by distance, right? What's different about us when in fact it started out that it was the points of contact that allowed the sort of integration of elites. And thirdly, they're a kingdom with parliament, they're a kingdom with their own kind of internal sanction. And thus, that seems to be sort of constitutionally a sticking point. I mean, it doesn't mean that it's not, there isn't a continuum, right? In what's going on in Ireland, what's going on in the West Indies, isn't related, but we might want to put them slightly differently on a kind of continuum of state intervention, and perhaps the issue might be the form might be the same, but the framework might be crucially different in some way. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
We have two questions, I think, that no one's responded to.
Can I just? Well, I mean, I think just going back to this exchange about the sort of continuities. I mean, I think one of the way to put it would be it's not only a violence. It's not only a question of where, but it's also kind of a question of who you are, right? Which is, so how violent the British state will sort of depends who you are, not only where you're at, but I think also we have to, what this discussion points out is to the way in which, in a sense, the development of sort of, or change of what is legitimate forms of violence also are not entirely, well, they're not only linear, but they're also not entirely linear in kind of the same setting, okay? So there is a kind of a story of what is legitimate in a colonial setting and then what the state actually does behind sort of quote-unquote closed doors, but also what is legitimate within the British state. I mean, one way to think about it is sort of capital punishment in a military setting. Okay, 300-something soldiers were executed during World War I. Suddenly, they didn't do that, right? It becomes illegitimate in a certain time. And then in the 90s, Tony Blair sort of actually puts their pardon as part of his political campaign. I mean, I think it's important to sort of also pay attention to those different moments and different setting, and in relation to different groups of people.
If I could respond also to that, to Bob, and to the question in the back. And I wonder, I was curious the examples that you gave of violence, back home. And I wonder if you consider, if you would consider anti-immigrant violence, which certainly has a rich tradition in 20th century England, and seems to be one of the things now in Ireland, which is pretty curious and tragic. We might be able to see sort of, violence. I suppose going back to sort of Priya's point that people don't really sort of understand what's going on, right? That wouldn't be controversial here, that there's violence out in the colonies, but a way in which we might be able to think about the way in which the state domestically, but also just people people living in England might have some connection to that colonial violence as the violence that they then sort of perpetrate on those who come from the colonies back home. And that can either be state violence, as you say, whacking Fenians on the head, but it could also be just savagely sort of keeping down immigrant, groups at home. So this kind of bouncing back and forth of domestic and colonial violence might be a way to also think about this across time.
And I just want to add to that, to Daniel's comment about the objects, the people who are subjected to violence. Then we talk about displacing violence to the colonial setting, to the slave ship, things like this. Sometimes it might be more useful to think about displacing violence to the margins, whether they be social or geographic. A lot of the talk of the displacement of violence from Britain ignores the rampant use of violence against working class or vagrants or things like this. The extension of the use of martial law in the 16th and early 17th century was fine in a political sense when it was used just against vagrants or the Irish, but only came to be a real political hot-button issue when it started to impinge upon people of middling status. So the displacement might be as much social as geographic in some ways.
Great. We have. Do you want to ask a question? No, you're not going now. I'm just taking a cue. Okay, yeah. Becky's going next, and then Jeff, and then Chris, and Ethan. And that will probably see us through, I think, until...
Well, Krista and Brendan just did this a little bit but it strikes me that somehow the Braddock model has mostly been abandoned this morning. And
that was so Friday.
I know. Well, I'm sorry. I'm sort of that kind of girl, I think. So, it totally strikes me. No, that. So I wonder if we can put in. I think also the shock and awe, literally, of Priya's work, helped us to abandon that model as well, because. But then Daniel's saying something about flogging of soldiers made me think, well, what about quotidian state apparatus violence in England in the 19th and 20th century? And I don't know what she's done with it, but Deborah Tom, the social historian in Cambridge, has been working of the flogging of schoolboys. And I assume a lot of that is in private schools, but I assume a lot of it is in state schools as well. So, can we think of other moments, spaces, times where quotidian violence is kind of unspoken in some ways, but completely acceptable as well?
Jeff.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to drag this back to the early modern again and comment on this notion of subject on subject violence that came out of both Brendan's paper and Krista's. So I'm going to drag in the notion Ethan raised that violence is a kind of punctuation, and say that if subject on subject violence is punctuation, then the Civil War is the exclamation point. Or maybe it's a whole series of punctuation marks together. I don't know what it is. But I think if you look at the Civil War from the early modern perspective, if you're standing in the reign of Elizabeth looking forward to what happens in 1642, then it looks like a spectacular failure of the state, if you define a state in this Weberian way we've been talking about as a monopoly of violence. Then when you have multiple state fragments that are fighting with each other, then everyone claims their violence is somehow legitimate. And what that means is that no one's violence is legitimate, that all this legitimacy and negotiation we're talking about comes down to who takes a bullet on the field of Naseby. So that looks like a collapse of the state into violence. If we're looking at this from the kind of early modern perspective we've raised, whether that's what Krista was talking about with the kind of hidden suppression of legal violence, the notion Brendan raised of exporting violence into a plantation society, or indeed the traditional kind of Lawrence Stone, the state exerts its control over noble violence that is pre-existing from the Middle Ages. But I think if you look at the Civil War from the other direction, if you take a look back into the 17th century from the long 18th, and if you take up this kind of functional definition of the state that we've been looking at for various modern terms, whether that's a warfare state or a fiscal military state, or the definition that Daniel raised, that the two main features of the 18th century state are its power to tax and its power to put an army in the field, that if you look at the Civil War from that perspective, then it looks very, very different, precisely because you have very high levels of both taxation and of military participation in England in the 1640s and 50s. So I don't necessarily know what that means, but I think it's interesting to look at the long 17th century as, if Krista identified that as the decline of interpersonal violence. I don't know if it declines necessarily as that interpersonal violence is aggregated into intergroup violence, and then those groups are co-opted into state institutions over the course of the 17th century. So I was just wondering if we look at violence between components of the state and violence for control of state institutions as points of early modern dialogue. Thanks.
And Ethan.
Well, I was going to say, I'm interested in this notion of sublimating violence and the sort of constant English denial that England is a violent state and what that might mean. And it's coming up in all these different contexts. And I was thinking about it, how comparative it is, right? That in the sort of Fortescue case in the 15th century, we don't torture, that's about, France does. And, you know, we're not judicially violent in this later 16th century is about, Spain is. And in the 20th century, obviously, it's, you know, this is contrasted with German barbarism and in many colonial contexts, colonial barbarism. And it led me to think about how that comparative frame makes the claim we're not violent itself a component of English state violence. Because they're always at war with these people who they're claiming are the really violent ones, and we're not. And this act of legitimation, you know, to say that we are not violent is a way of saying that they are, and that act of legitimation is a direct contributor to the war effort, right? That's part and parcel of an ongoing battle waged in the field and a struggle for English superiority. So it strikes me that we can sort of push further on the nature of England's subtle or rarefied or sublimated violence as being somehow historically important and might have something specific to do with England's remarkably violent historical trajectory in the last 400 years.
Great question, and I have to say you sound more and more like Barry White when you hold that microphone. Steve Pincus, and then we'll let everyone respond. Oh, sorry, Chris. Sorry. And well, then we'll have to do it.
Okay. Well, I think I'm taking my life in my hands by taking a question away from Steve.
I'll protect you.
Yeah.
For a prize.
Violence is not writing a letter to recommendation.
Oh, okay. Perhaps even worse. I wanted to go back to a point that Priya raised that hasn't really come up about violence by omission as well as violence by commission. And I was reminded when Brendan was talking about violence against immigrants, right? And maybe this is a way of thinking about one difference between colonial and sort of metropolitan violence is that, you know, in Iraq, right, the state commits violence by bombing villages. But in Britain, the state might commit violence by, you know, being slow to respond to demands by, say, immigrant neighborhoods or minority neighborhoods for police protection. So the state isn't, you know, beating them, but the state is kind of allowing other people to beat them. So maybe that's another way of getting at this, you know, colonial metropolitan thing.
I just want to quickly respond to Ethan's line about this kind of sublimation and this denial that England is violent. And two things quickly. One, I don't know, this is the book by Young about sort of Victorian frame of mind, or, you know, sort of that classic study, but that I read very long ago, obviously. But there's a quote in it. From somebody at a public school, which might go to Becky's point, saying, yes, we're the English because we're not like these sissified French, or these kind of, intellectual Germans, but we kick ass, right? I'm English, you want to see it, right? And that seems to me to be a real celebration, of violence amongst the Victorians. But Fortescue, I think, also has a rather different sort of attention to violence, because it seems to me that the violence that he's concerned about is not we're fighting against other people who are violent, in a kind of physical sense, but we're fighting against people who are kind of violent in a sort of tyrannical, ungodly sense. Because, what does he say about the French? It's like, well, the French king is such a bastard, he impoverishes the state, and that's not good. Our kings, who are good kings, don't, and that's why our archers are so tough and then kick ass. So he loves that. So, I don't know if that's really in the mindset. So a modern and early modern example.
Yeah, and traditionally, things are only deemed violent if they're also deemed illegitimate. I mean, so much of the discussion is about ends and means. So it's the ends to which this forceful action is put, which makes it violent or not in the way it's traditionally discussed. And I think that has to come into any discussion of English claims about their nonviolence. It's their perception of their own ends as much as the use of the means. Some of the other comments, again, probably getting lost in all the questions. I may be forgetting or misunderstanding what Becky was asking. But I think if we talk about domestic violence, this also brings us back to the Braddock thesis, and certainly the notion of the state as the ultimate arbiter of what constitutes legitimate violence. And there were mentions yesterday of habeas corpus and this sort of thing. I mean, the idea that habeas corpus can be used to free a wife from the control of her husband, again, this suggests something about the ways in which the patriarch can be deputized as an agent of the state. And so if you want to talk about a form of quotidian violence that's generally unexceptional, domestic violence would be it. I mean, it's 1891 that it becomes illegal to abuse your wife in the sense, so that might be an example of what you're asking about.
Just to pick up then where Krista left off, there were some questions, I think maybe Becky or Maura, I can't remember now, about different kinds of violence and how we think about them, and as you were mentioning, the importance of these ends and means arguments, which I think are common in the history of Britain's use of violence, but you can see it as well in French cases, for instance, in Algerian torture or whatever. But I think, so when we, as historians, choose to talk about violence, and some of the questions we were asked to think about were, how do you know state violence when you see it? Or, I mean, I think, in some sense, as Daniel started out saying, the state is violence, right? You could say everything the state does is violence. But as historians, I think it's very important that we have to prioritize, right, at some level. And I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but bear with me. So I think common sense is really, really helpful when we get into these discussions, because wherever there's a balance of pain at issue, I think that should govern when, instead of getting caught up in is that violent or not violent. I think that is a useful way to decide what is worth studying and what is worth, drawing attention to as state violence. So that's my sort of personal guide, and I find that helpful. What Ethan was saying about everyone, this kind of British kind of dream that everyone is violent but us, and we only pursue war because they're so barbaric and we have to. And I absolutely agree with you. I think that is what makes British violence so distinctive, and it's so consistent. I think in the modern period, at least, which is which is the only thing I know about. And I think there was a question about violence by omission. What's your name? Chris. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting idea, but I do think that violence by omission, I don't know if that distinguishes the colonial and the metropolitan setting so much. I mean, certainly I mentioned the Bengal famine of 1943. I mean, there are plenty of cases, I think, where that was a very kind of convenient way of dealing with issues on the ground in the colonies, was for people to fulfill the protective kind of tasks that the state is supposed to do, and that gives it whatever legitimacy it can have. So that's all I'll say right now.
I just wanted, I'm a little bit troubled by this attempt that came out of some of the questions to sort of find continuities between violence, domestic violence, colonial violence. I mean, I think it's important to recognize that there are continuities are sort of everywhere, but there are significant differences. I'm talking about the modern, period. There's significant differences you go in terms of, I mean, I don't know, just, you know, Priya sitting here, you bomb some places and you don't bomb others, and these issues come again and again. You know, and torture was mentioned. And we can talk about forms of imprisonment, I mean, and so forth. But it also, I found Becky's question very interesting in terms of this question of which we haven't really talked about, where it relates to where is the state and what are the instruments of violence. I want to just raise it as a question that we're obviously not gonna discuss, but because you know, sometimes violence, instruments of violence are, for instance, when it comes to the East India Company, we can think of violence that is kind of outsourced. When we talk about quotidian violence, you know, it raises exactly the questions we talked about last time: where is the state, and what forms, and you know, but then we have to sort of have an idea, and I absolutely agree with Priya in terms of what is it that you know, a kind of a commonsensical idea, because violence is kind of everywhere, right? I mean, and it can very easily diffuse the discussion.
Okay, oh my goodness, it's 11 o'clock and there's a forest of hands going up. I promised that.
Give Steve.
Well, we did start 5 minutes late, so we'll do Steve, Caroline, and Jane. The last questions. Who?
Is there someone missed?
Yeah, right. It was Steve, Caroline, Jane, and...
Anyone can ask a question. We'll just stay and just keep the questions coming.
So I just wanted to raise some questions about Ethan's narrative here. It strikes me that the lack of the long 18th century sort of has created a bit of a problem about this notion. I think it's absolutely right that there's a development over time of the notion of exceptional British peacefulness, but nobody in the late 17th or early or throughout the 18th century accepted this notion. So in fact, the dominant rhetoric, both on the continent and within Britain itself, was how bloody violent and exceptionally violent British society was. So if you, I mean, there's pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet. You can write from the 1660s straight through to the 1790, and I think 1790 is a key moment of the transfer. What? Right, no. This is all about the state as violent, about the violence of the state. The rhetoric, I mean, the rhetoric about the Jacobite rebellions, which I realize is, you know, beyond your ken, is something which is, I mean, this is something which is discussed all throughout Europe. I mean, this is a point that is made over and over and over again. Now, this changes dramatically at the moment. I mean, the French Revolution is an incredibly important moment. Now, in transforming the sort of self-perception of Brits and also the European perception of the relationship between the state and violence. Now, I think that there is an important distinction about discussions about what kind of violence is being perpetrated by the state. And I think this discussion about Fortescue is very interesting. And that is to say, you know, we don't torture, we do other things. But that's not a sort of global position about how violent the state is. I think throughout the 18th century, there's just pamphlet after pamphlet after pamphlet, both, you know, in German literature, in French literature, and in British literature about just how bloody violent the British state is.
Okay, what we're going to do now is take a series of comments rather than questions, because I just don't think people are going to have time to respond in a meaningful way to this.
Okay, and I think Steve's just gotten to some of the early modern implications of what I was going to raise in a second, and that's, again, the importance of the comparative, externally comparative context. And I wanted to interrogate this sort of narrative that we're getting about the later modern period, where Britain is an exception when you look at revolutionary Europe during the 19th century, when you look at Germany during the 20th century, in whether or not that was actually true, but the use of that narrative as a distinctive force, because I think that the importance is to look at moments when that narrative seems not to work, and to start also looking at those places in which there are, even in these points, questions about whether or not Britain actually plays in what I'm thinking about particularly, but I think there are other moments of this as well that are incredibly important. Or looking at, like, say, extradition law post-1870, when you get to a point where, the British, want to deny the fact that they're actually trying to crack down on Irish Fenians, for instance, but they actually have to come up with a definition of who's extraditable and who's not internationally in a way that sort of belies their notion that we are the, sort of the non-violent, we don't have political offenders of our own in a way that they, like to pretend in earlier moments. So if we start looking at those moments as well, we can also start to see how, in productive ways, that attempt to perhaps hide what's going on does and doesn't work, and what that actually does to the use of attempts to legitimize violence in different ways, and also in terms of justice as well.
I wanted to say that I was quite taken with Ethan's narrative, actually. And so, but I wanted to relate it to Becky's comment, because I took you as saying, Ethan, you were talking a bit about how the British see themselves and justify things to themselves as opposed to, of course, any reality. And it strikes me that the everyday violence of British life, particularly that perpetuated by the state against people who don't count, is one way you can make yourself believe that. So there are numerous examples. The one immediately came into my head was the constant police harassment of and violence against gay men until the Wolfenden Act in the 20th century. So I think you could marry up their feelings about how they respond to the outer world by what they're doing in everyday, ordinary violence against people they consider their own citizens who don't count.
Most of what we've been talking about today has related to kind of actual violence, the way that the state acted violently or reacted to forms of violence. And I wanted to just mention that we should really consider the ways in which kind of imagined violence or anticipation of violence really drove state formation in a lot of ways. And specifically, I'm thinking about in the late 17th century, committees were continually formed for pacifying clan violence in the Highlands, when in reality, clan violence had really decreased. And it was a means by which to legitimate the increased extent of state apparatuses and things like that throughout Britain. So I think we really need to think about violence as not necessarily reflective of what's occurring, but as an imagined violence or reaction to perceived violence.
That was a great final round of comments. So I'm not sure that our panel needs to respond unless someone is absolutely desperately urgent to. I'm not seeing a whole lot of desperate urgency.
Does everyone want to just go?
No, you can make one comment.
I'll just, Michelle, is that your name? I thought what you said and what Ethan said kind of dovetail in a nice way, in the sense, you're a very animated audience member, Steve. It's very distracting. There's always this flutter of activity over here.
In our defense, though, we did talk about. I mentioned, and then James and I went back. Talked a bit about Highland clearances and those sorts of things. So I absolutely agree, and I think that's the imagined element, though, of that is really. It's very interesting.
But I just want to say that in general, I think what's been missing from this discussion or lurking beneath it is that culture is obviously really important in shaping the way that the state acts, whether it's imagination, whether it's rationalizations or self-understandings or whatever. So and I think, you can't, which is really convenient since so many of us are cultural historians and we also want to work on the state. And maybe that's why we think of it in those terms. But I just thought that was an interesting thread that was emerging in the last comments.
And any talk of criminal justice obviously has to take account of, crime waves are so often constructed. It's not just a product of want, it's also a product of fear, which is often imagined. And so any of these bouts of unusually harsh repression in the state in terms of criminal justice against the domestic population are very often a response to fears as opposed to actual events. So
great. So we've got coffee now for half an hour, and then there's a breakout session from 11:30 to 12:30 on job letters. So I hope that all you graduate students who will eventually be on the job market will come.